described by many as a tragedy, and even as Australia's biggest military blunder since World War II. Today, we're diving into one of the most controversial decisions ever made by the Australian Command during the Vietnam War. It's a decision that ultimately, either directly or indirectly, would be linked to the deaths of more than 50 Australian soldiers and the wounding of hundreds more. This is the story of the infamous Barrier Minefield. Today, we're going to break down the decisions that led to the creation of the Barrier Minefield and explore the consequences that then followed. Taking over command of the Australian task force from Brigadier David Jackson in early January 1967, Brigadier Stuart Graham was deemed one of the Australian Army's high achievers, with a firm grounding in military history and a sound grasp of tactical theory. At Duntroon Royal Military College, Graham had excelled academically, was ambitious, and was known for his unorthodox and innovative tactical solutions to military problems, and came top of his class. A veteran of World War II, Graham was deemed a high achiever with lots of potential, and he quickly rose through the ranks of the Australian Army. He was described as a marvellous soldier, with the ability to read a situation much better than anyone else. However, more critical descriptions of Graham and his personality are as follows. A politician soldier united to the war being fought, i.e. the Vietnam War, with an ideological approach that eclipsed military judgment. And he was completely loyal to soldiers and superiors, unlike those that suck up to those above them and kick those beneath them. But if he got something into his head, he'd go with it. A third and final quote describing Brigadier Graham's character, which I found interesting, was thus: thoughtful, clever, imaginative, and markedly stubborn. His predecessor, Brigadier Jackson, had successfully established the task force in the heart of Phuoc Tuy, adopted aggressive patrolling, and pushed the Viet Cong main force units to the province's periphery. To build on that initial success, Brigadier Graham would take a different approach. Strategically, the Australian base at Nui Dat was established mainly to protect local villages in the south and centre of the province from Viet Cong entering the province from the north or the east. The enemy also operated from a stronghold in the long high hills to the south by the coast, and in a strip of land to the east, known to the Aussies as the Long Green. Graham believed the Long Green was a key tactical area of importance. Cutting off links between the Long Green and local villages would, in his view, make the Viet Cong in the locality wither on the vine. With no supply of rice or recruits, the enemy in the province would be beaten. Graham decided that the next course of action was to separate the local Vietnamese population from Viet Cong field units. Graham believed local villagers were not communist sympathisers and would naturally support the South Vietnamese government if those elements, i.e. the National Liberation Front Viet Cong, were driven from their communities. In hindsight, this view was misplaced and possibly naive, perhaps more wishful thinking than reality. Graham did not understand that many local villagers essentially had a more practical and survival-orientated view that one day the Australians will go home and the Viet Cong will likely take over. So we need to get used to them. Many other villagers were largely hostile to any foreign presence in the province and would not support the Australians. And furthermore, there were a significant number of Vietnamese villagers who were sympathetic to the communist cause, especially when local villages had been demolished in the years before to make way for the Australian base at Nui Dat. Using effective propaganda, the communists had exploited this, turning many local villagers away from supporting the South Vietnamese government and the Australians. Even so, Graham still believed weakening the ties between local Vietnamese and the enemy would erode communist influence and infiltration of villages and undermine any support for the Viet Cong. Therefore, rather than focus on the US mission of search and destroy operations and eliminating the enemy in Vietnam, Graham would change the diggers' mission to focusing on providing security for local populations and restoring law and order. By cutting off the lines of communication between the Viet Cong's field units and the province's villages, Graham believed that the VC would likely be forced to offer battle to break the interdiction of their supply corridors, or gradually lose support and wither away. The Americans were sceptical of this new Australian plan. They wanted set-piece, decisive actions, such as at Long Tan. Their focus was on eliminating the enemy and body count. The Yanks were not impressed with what they saw as Graham and the Australians tiptoeing around with hearts and minds and quiet efforts. At the end of January 1967, the US MACV commander, General Westmoreland, thought the task force under Graham's leadership very inactive. Graham's immediate in-country US boss, Lieutenant General Jonathan Seaman, commander of the 2nd Field Force, was even more critical, labelling the Australians at this time as not aggressive. Ignoring criticism from the Americans, Graham stuck to his guns and began focusing on planning his new strategy. The task force constituted around 3,600 soldiers at the time, with only 2 infantry battalions who were relentlessly overworked with little rest. One of those battalions would furthermore generally have to be dedicated to defence at Nui Dat, restricting offensive capabilities even further. Therefore, Graham believed he lacked sufficient combat troops ready to carry out his vision. When starting his tour of duty in early January 1967, Canberra refused to send Graham reinforcements, such as an extra infantry battalion or tanks. These would only arrive around 12 months later when politicians finally relented. With the limited resources available to him, Brigadier Graham now believed the only effective option that he was open to him to cut off the Viet Cong from their logistical supplies was the laying of mines. Graham assessed the most important source of supplies for the Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy was the area around Dat Do village, which was termed as the province's granary. The construction of the minefield barrier in this vicinity would, Graham believed, prevent Charlie moving from their mountain bases to the rice-growing areas in the west, denying them freedom of movement and thus protecting the local villagers from communist influence. In addition, the minefield would in essence separate and shield the province's most densely populated areas in the southwest district of Long Dat from enemy units operating in the north and east. Therefore, it was decided by Brigadier Graham to begin a mine-laying project that would start in March 1967. The minefield would be built stretching 11 kilometres, from the Horseshoe Feature, passing the eastern side of Dat Do and 2 other villages, and ending up at the sea. Sappers of the Royal Australian Engineers would lay the mines. The completed minefield would then be guarded by the South Vietnamese. At the time, according to Paul Ham's book Vietnam the Australian War, the 2 infantry battalion commanders under Graham were vehemently opposed to the idea, as well as the commander of the Engineer Field Squadron, whose job it would be to lay the barrier. The senior officers warned that the mines were a two-edged weapon and that they could be stolen by the enemy and relayed. Some of the Australian officers were veterans of the Korean War and knew in Korea that this tactic was exactly what the Chinese and Koreans did. Many rank-and-file diggers also ridiculed the idea of a minefield, believing that the Viet Cong were far too resourceful to be impacted long-term or significantly by the installation of a minefield. The mining would begin in March with the infantrymen of 5 RAR involved in back-breaking labour, driving thousands of metal pickets into the earth and stringing out tons of concertina barbed wire. 5 RAR would later be relieved by 7 RAR, who would take over the task. The infantrymen would build 2 wire fences 2 metres high 100 metres apart and 11 kilometres long. The sappers would then begin laying nearly 23,000 M16 jumping jack mines in the lanes between the two fences. The M16 mine was a heavy, steel-cased anti-personnel jumping mine containing about half a kilogram of TNT and triggered by pressure or a tripwire. When activated, it used a short delay to launch itself out of the ground before detonating at knee to waist height, scattering lethal metal fragments in all directions. The American-made mine was usually lethal within a 25-metre radius and was known to have killed at 75 metres. It was even deemed dangerous at 200 metres distance. Graham also insisted that an anti-lift grenade be attached and placed on every second mine, adding to the work. In total, about 11,000 of these mines would be attached to grenades. It was a two-man job to lay each mine, requiring a huge amount of concentration. The slightest disturbance could trigger an explosion. Removing safety pins would be an extremely nerve-wracking time for every sapper. Graham was determined to complete the job before the local rice harvest in June, in order to deny any of that harvest to the enemy. Commencing on the 6th of March, the mine laying was given the code name Operation Leeton. Sapper John Jethro Thompson stated, "Mine laying was one of the many tasks sappers would have to do. We would work as a section. Collectively, we were putting about 400 mines in each day. And then the powers that be decided that we weren't laying enough mines. Under pressure to complete the task, casualties would now begin to occur." On the 6th of April, one soldier was killed and 2 wounded. On the next day, another officer was killed. Later, an American would also be killed in the minefield, with a digger receiving a military medal for going into the field to bravely retrieve the victim's body. During the month of May, 5 sappers would die and 10 more would be wounded, many receiving horrific life-changing injuries. Thompson recalled, "You were very hot, very uncomfortable, and facing death." Despite the danger and seeing their mates struck by mines, the sappers incredibly cracked on with the job. That must have taken extraordinary courage. Several sources, including interviews and books, state that the sappers involved in the operation reportedly received little to no training in mine laying prior to deployment, nor time to conduct intensive rehearsals. All practice was therefore, in essence, on-the-job training. To add even more danger to the process, during the nighttime hours, the Viet Cong would drive animals such as pigs, dogs and chickens into the minefield to trigger explosions and delay and complicate the process. Artillery based at the Horseshoe would cover the infantrymen and sappers who were engaged at the work. Towards the end of May, for a short period, mounting casualties forced a temporary halt to the project, but it was completed finally on the 1st of June. Although details of the minefield had initially been withheld from the Australian public, the steady flow of casualties soon sparked public controversy and provoked difficult questions in Parliament. Once finished, to protect the barrier, the diggers would build additional fortified posts for the local ARVN and South Vietnamese forces. The fence would only have 3 crossing points in which traffic could be inspected and monitored by the South Vietnamese security forces. Observing the minefield preparations, the Viet Cong began storing food supplies and planning alternative supply routes. Initially, for up to 6 months, the minefield would impact VC operations. However, that would soon change. As ever, the enemy would adapt to their new environment. Dung Song Min, a Viet Cong soldier, recalled, "We saw the fence as an obstacle, and we resolved to destroy it." For the local Viet Cong leadership, the minefield presented opportunities rather than threats. Here was a ready supply of modern weaponry. As early as the end of May, the Viet Cong would start breaching the minefield fence with wire cutters. Soon, dedicated teams would start lifting mines during the night hours. Akin to samurai warriors from Japan, they would engage in a drinking ceremony prior to venturing into the minefield. Infiltrating the field, mainly from the west, the Viet Cong would use tiny bits of white paper to mark their trail and use teams of up to 50 to 60 porters per night to carry the mines away. By September, the Viet Cong claimed to lift 200 mines a night and would use women and children in this process, whose delicate fingers were suited to the task. Incredibly, some mine lifters after a time began to live within the minefield after the Viet Cong leadership thought that travelling in and out would present too much of a danger and that it was more efficient to place people within the minefield to conduct operations. They would even start lifting during the daytime. That said, at least 36 Viet Cong were killed lifting the mines and scores more injured. Their success was primarily due to the Achilles heel of the minefield, which was the South Vietnamese security forces. The ARVN and regional and popular forces guarding the minefield were ineffective. The ARVN battalion assigned to guard the field was assessed as a low-quality unit, and there weren't enough men or searchlights. The South Vietnamese would also prefer to stay inside in the protection of their posts rather than patrol the fence line, so conducted little patrolling. Therefore, unable to effectively cover the minefield through observation and fire, the enemy had freedom of movement in many parts of the field. Another problem was that the mines were sensitive to climate and terrain. They were buried in damp, boggy ground. Many of the anti-lifting devices would fail to function properly. Some diggers would start to joke that the minefield was Charlie's ordnance depot. Brigadier Graham finished his tour in October 1967 and wrote that the minefield had imposed a logistical stranglehold on the enemy. Charlie is virtually finished in Phuoc Tuy Province. He has lost the people and the resources, and without these he cannot live. However, the Americans disagreed with Graham and stated, "Little permanent damage has been inflicted on the VC infrastructure in Phuoc Tuy and its capacity to carry out its mission." By late 1967 and Graham's departure, the task force had effectively abandoned the idea of maintaining or securing the minefield. This was due to the limited resources available to them. The Viet Cong would also use mines to specifically target Australian sappers. Australian sapper Robert Earl stated of the enemy, "They were very clever. They would set a mine, for instance an M16 mine. They were pulling them up from our minefield, pulling a pin out of a grenade and sitting down under the ground and sitting the mine on top. The M16 to keep the grenade loaded and fill it in. When we'd come along, we'd see the mine and unscrew the mine. Make it safe at the top, unscrew the detonating device out of it. Lift the mine out, and when we did, the grenade would go off." In late February 1968, Operation Pinaroo began in the Long High Hills, a Viet Cong stronghold. Many Australian casualties were caused by ordnance lifted from the barrier minefield, with platoons being decimated by mine strikes without a shot being fired. Approximately 15 diggers would be killed and 33 wounded by M16 mines. The horrific casualties sustained in this operation would lead to the Australian leadership changing their policy on the minefield. Now realising that the barrier minefield was causing more damage and impact on his own troops than the enemy, Brigadier Hughes, who was Graham's successor, ordered the destruction of the minefield. Australian sappers would begin the dangerous task of sweeping and clearing the barrier minefield. It would take nearly 2 years to clear the mines from the field. By then, the mines had contributed significantly to the Australian casualty rate in Vietnam, and it's estimated the enemy had lifted around 3,000 mines from the minefield during that time. A Viet Cong fighter stated, "If we saw the Australians coming, we laid mines so that they'd be dead if they came back. A return along the same track meant death." Commentators who defend the barrier argue that it was only one part of a much broader mine problem in Vietnam. Across Phuoc Tuy, Long Dat region, Numerous other minefields contained similar numbers of M16 mines, and the widespread use of booby traps, grenades, improvised explosive devices and unexploded ordnance meant Australian casualties were likely to be high regardless. Enemy efforts to recover and reuse mines were both extensive and deadly across Vietnam, and Vietnamese civilian and military losses were probably comparable to those suffered by US and Allied forces. That's the counter-argument anyway. The legacy of the minefield and other minefields in Vietnam has been thousands of civilians or animals being continually maimed or killed by these devices decades after the war has ended. The barrier minefield has been described as a gross error of judgment at the highest levels of command. Although it appeared promising at the beginning in theory and on paper, without the right resources to properly secure the minefield, it was doomed from the beginning. Graham may have had the right idea or intention, but when it came to executing the plan, it was fundamentally flawed. In Vietnam, Aussie sappers were forward scouts, mine clearers, bridge builders and tunnel rats. They were among the first to arrive in country and the last to leave. Over the course of the conflict, many would be awarded decorations for gallantry. These could include the Military Cross, Military Medal or mention in dispatches. There would be other awards such as the OBE, Order of the British Empire, amongst others. In my own opinion, I'd consider the role of a sapper in Vietnam as one of the most dangerous jobs in the whole conflict. And that's on either side. And speaking of the diggers, from acting as tunnel rats one day to laying mines another, these chaps must have had nerves of steel and been incredibly brave. And I've got nothing but the greatest of respect for them. We'll continue with this mini-series at roughly one a month. But thanks for watching. I hope you found some value from this, and I'll see you in the next one.